Bad Religion are one of the most influential punk bands of all time. They are known for lyrical themes that deal with social commentary involving politics, philosophy, history, science, and consciousness. Not only did Bad Religion become leaders of the new rise of American punk in the early 1990s, they became a point of reference, setting the tone for a new, updated melodic punk sound with a mix of harmonies, melody, and speed, influencing several subgenres from melodic hardcore, skate punk, and pop punk to alternative and indie rock. In addition to their music, Bad Religion also became a symbol for DIY punk culture, with founding guitarist and songwriter Brett Gurewitz's label Epitaph Records, rising from a small loan from his dad and a box of 500 EPs to one of the biggest labels in alternative music history. With the DIY ethic and in-your-face musical stance that seemed to be critical of all things mainstream and capitalistic, Bad Religion shocked the punk rock world by signing to major label Atlantic Records in 1993 and releasing their major label debut, Stranger Than Fiction, the following year. Signing to a major label brought the band to unforeseeable new heights, with their subversive music and message making its way to radio stations, TVs, and record shops across the world. But as their popularity grew in the mid-1990s, so too did criticism that the band had betrayed the DIY punk ethic that they seemed to champion throughout their career. And as a response, vocalist Greg Graffin claimed that the band's growth and mainstream accessibility were all part of the, quote, democratization of punk. So how much of Bad Religion's mainstream success had to do with marketing and commercialization, and how much of it had to do with democratization? Or, in other words, the band wanting its music and message to become more accessible to more people? Hi there, I'm Joe Meyer and this is Heavy Academia, a platform for discussions about heavy music. In this video, I want to discuss how and why Bad Religion went mainstream in the mid-1990s, and to try and address the question of how the major label experience affected the band, how they navigated within the world of mainstream rock, and how much, if any, of their core identity and music were impacted by all of this. Now, as someone who's been a fan of Bad Religion for a long time now, I have to say that knowing they put out a few albums on a major label in the 90s didn't necessarily make me think any less of them. They're still great musicians and songwriters, but I do think that some of the albums they released on Atlantic Records are among the weakest in their entire catalog, and that might have less to do with them signing to a major label than it does hearing and feeling the absence of Brett Gurewitz, who left the band in 1994 right before the release of Stranger Than Fiction. And so, rather than being pessimistic and trashing the band for their business decisions, instead, I've always wanted to find out more about what motivated them to sign to a major label, especially since by the time they released Stranger Than Fiction, Epitaph Records had already become one of the biggest independent labels in the world, doing an estimated $60 million worth of business in the mid-1990s alone. And this was bolstered by the success of bands signed to the label like The Offspring, NoFX, and Rancid. So if it was all just about the money, Bad Religion could have easily been successful just staying with Epitaph. So what motivated this significant move from DIY punk to the big world of corporate rock? First of all, it's important to note that Bad Religion had a pretty significant semi-hiatus from 1983 to 1986, during which they still played occasionally and even put out an EP in 1985, Back to the Known, with new guitarist Greg Hetson. Now, a 3-year semi-hiatus with an EP in between might not seem like much by today's standards, but in the 1980s, a lot happened in the meantime, including what appeared to be the severe decline of punk rock in the United States. After its original groundbreaking phenomenon in the late 1970s and early 80s, punk rock in the US began to wane by 1983, with multiple punk bands either calling it quits or slowing down and becoming more experimental, including Bad Religion themselves. In 1983, the band followed up their successful debut album, How Could Hell Be Any Worse, with an experimental prog rock album, Into the Unknown. And this album in many ways marked the end of the band's first run, with Brett Gurewitz saying that, "I took all the records and had a ritual burning. I burned boxes of vinyl in my driveway. After a couple of boxes, I realized what a toxic death fire I was creating. Terrible, noxious smoke rising up out of the driveway." Like the smoke created by Brett's burning of the record, Into the Unknown became a black mark of sorts for the band that they hoped would be forgotten. But still, it showed that the band wasn't afraid to experiment outside of the boundaries of punk rock. And after the failure of their sophomore album, the members went their separate ways, with Brett Gurewitz heavily experimenting with drugs and focusing more on growing Epitaph Records, and lead vocalist Greg Graffin going to grad school at UCLA. But it was after a reunion show of sorts at 924 Gilman Street in Berkeley that the band gained a renewed energy due to the positive reaction from fans, and they vowed to use this momentum to pump out some fresh material. Reforming with an initially reluctant Brett Gurewitz, Bad Religion made an almost immediate impact with the releases of 3 back-to-back albums: Suffer, No Control, and Against the Grain. These albums showcased the band's renewed energy and focus, as well as more mature songwriting, playing, and recording skills. According to NoFX's Fat Mike, the album Suffer invigorated our whole scene. That's what changed everything. While The Offspring's Dexter Holland said that it was kinda the start of something new. It was sort of a melodic kind of thing that people hadn't really done before. But the year 1993 was the real turning point for Bad Religion and Epitaph, who would both reach a new pinnacle and at the same time part ways. Around 1994, bands like NoFX, Rancid, and The Offspring would make Brett Gurewitz and Epitaph one of the most successful independent music ventures of all time, with NoFX's 1994 release Punk in Drublic eventually going gold, Rancid's 1994 album Let's Go reaching the Billboard 200, and The Offspring's 1994 album Smash became the best-selling album on an independent label of all time. And so one potentially tempting conclusion that actually falls short is that Bad Religion, while having directly inspired and influenced many of these bands, didn't reach the same level of success. And because of their being sidelined in the punk explosion that was catalyzed by bands on their own label, they decided to sign with a major. But Bad Religion actually signed to Atlantic Records before any of these bands' breakout albums were released, even a few months before Green Day's Dookie came out. But still, Epitaph was already making a huge impact and garnering more and more sales, so much so that Bad Religion bassist Jay Bentley, who helped out with Epitaph operations, said that in the early 90s, album sales were exploding, with more and more orders from record shops and distributors coming in. And he revealed that it was really steady in growth. You could tell month to month. We'll take 10, we'll take 50, we'll take 100, we'll take 250, we'll take 1,000. By the time we hit Against the Grain, our pre-orders were insane. So if it wasn't resentment over not getting the same amount of attention as other Epitaph bands, then what did inspire them to sign with a major label? Fat Mike, who is a well-known supporter of Bad Religion, offers some insight by revealing that when Bad Religion signed to a major, I remember Greg Graffin telling me, "We're just gonna see how far we can take this." But in my opinion, the best way to answer the question is to see what the band members themselves had to say. And as it turns out, they were pretty much unanimously in favor of switching to a major label, especially Atlantic Records. And it helped that they clicked with Danny Goldberg, who had helped sign Nirvana, the band that almost single-handedly opened the door for punk bands to become accepted in the mainstream. According to Brett, who was in favor of signing to Atlantic despite his success with Epitaph, my self-esteem was low enough to think that a major label could do more for the band than I ever could. Like many recording artists, I always wondered if the majors had some kind of secret sauce that they weren't sharing with the rest of us. Turns out, they don't. And Greg Graffin, who was by now continuing his graduate studies at Ithaca, seemed to see the major label as a way for the band to get its message across to a wider audience, as well as a significant financial boon. He said that the second we signed with a major label, distribution immediately improved. We could go to cities all over America and our record would be there, not just at the indie record store, but at the malls. It was part of the democratization of punk that was going on at the time. But he also said that at first, it wasn't crazy money. We didn't take a lot up front, but we made a lot on the back end of sales, which was, according to the band, mostly thanks to the savviness of their lawyer. So based on these statements, it seems the band's main motivations were wanting to test the waters and see how big they could get. And so this leads to the question, did the band have to sacrifice any of their core identity, including their musical intensity, to get where they wanted? While Atlantic would re-release Recipe for Hate, which was first released on Epitaph in 1993, Stranger Than Fiction was Bad Religion's first contractual album with the label. In a lot of ways, the album has plenty of songs that are recognizable and quintessential Bad Religion songs, but there are also some that seem to be a bit more of an accessible departure from their earlier work. And none represent the shift better than the single Infected, which comes off as more of a post-grunge alternative rock song about personal struggle, which can be easily interpreted by some people as sort of a love song, rather than a political or thought-provoking punk anthem.
Please talk about no one, someone, anyone. You
According to Gurewitz, who wrote the song not too long before leaving the band, Nirvana had proven that as long as the tempo doesn't freak anybody out, you can get on the radio with loud guitars. Infected was my attempt at writing a grunge song. We got signed to a major and I thought, we're a punk band, but at the same time we've got to stay relevant. So it might be smart to write a grunge-infused Bad Religion song. Now Infected would prove to be one of the breakout singles for Bad Religion's major label phase, along with the slower tempo, groovy single 21st Century Digital Boy, which had actually been re-recorded and re-released from its original version in Against the Grain, since the label thought it would be a good single, something that Brett didn't fully agree with. And so it would seem that while the band were determined to spread their message and promote the punk rock values that they came up in, they were also happy to sprinkle some more experimental and even radio-friendly tracks on their major label albums. But this is a tendency that the band had already demonstrated with the release of Into the Unknown. But despite outliers like Infected or 21st Century Digital Boy 2.0, Stranger Than Fiction continued to demonstrate the strong co-songwriting of Gurewitz and Graffin, with plenty of the mix between melody and skate punk energy and speeds of their previous records, making it both one of their most successful albums and for many fans one of their best as well. But it was after Gurewitz's departure from the band shortly before Stranger Than Fiction was released, along with the pressures from Atlantic Records, that the band would face its biggest musical challenges. While the follow-up to Stranger Than Fiction, The Grey Race, had some memorable and recognizable songs for both new fans and those who knew the band's music before they signed to Atlantic, the following two albums, No Substance and The New America, are often cited as two of their weakest albums. And not that they're necessarily bad, they just don't really stand out in comparison to their other albums. These two releases just so happened to be the band's last two on Atlantic Records, and they are often criticized for sounding uninspired and lacking both the energy, urgency, and creativity for which the band had become known. And some of the band members themselves seem to agree with this, with Jay Bentley saying that, "I like The Grey Race a lot. As for No Substance and The New America, collectively, we feel that their songs are okay. They certainly weren't our strongest records." And there is some evidence that the Atlantic Records experience had a lot to do with the mediocre output, showing that the experience of being on a major label did in fact impact the band's songwriting. For example, Atlantic decided that No Substance had poor sales due to the lack of over-the-top production. But Jay Bentley disagreed, and he said that the record didn't suffer because we didn't spend money on it. The record didn't do well because we didn't take it seriously. When we went into the studio, no songs had been written. We didn't know what we wanted to do. It was very piecemeal. And this suggests that the band wasn't quite ready to put out an album, but had to anyways due to their obligations with the label. And according to Bad Religion biographer Jim Ruland, there was a feeling within the band that, because of the label's influence and or the direction from outside producers, some of the songs from the Atlantic era hadn't been developed as fully as they could have been, that they'd been let down and led astray by their label. But still, the completion of the band's 4-album deal with Atlantic at the end of the millennium led to Brett Gurewitz returning to Bad Religion, and the album The Process of Belief was released in 2002, the band's first release on Epitaph Records since Recipe for Hate almost 10 years earlier. And while not usually considered to be Bad Religion's best album, The Process of Belief is often hailed as a return to form. It outperformed all of the band's previous 3 major label releases, and in my personal opinion, was their best album since Stranger Than Fiction. In conclusion, I think it's safe to say that Bad Religion have always been reaching for something bigger, all the way back to 1983 when they released Into the Unknown. And while that gamble was mostly a failure, they're pushing the limits by joining a major label 10 years later in 1993, and experimenting more with indie and alternative rock was a huge success for the band, and a huge boost to the new accessibility of punk rock in the 1990s. And while the major label switch might have been a big deal in the mid-90s, when looking back at the band's entire catalog, I really don't think that the major label experiment has defined the band's legacy in any significant way, and the band are much more well known for epitaph releases like Suffer, No Control, and even The Process of Belief. But I would rather hear what you all think. What is Bad Religion's legacy in relation to them joining a major label in the mid-1990s? Do you think they can still be considered as a symbol of the DIY punk ethic? And how would you compare the music that they put out during the Atlantic years with some of the music that they put out before and after? Thank you for watching, and see you next time here on Heavy Academia.